Welcome to the Low Impact Development Code Update and Integration webinar for Stormwater Practitioners. My name is Gretchen Muller, and I am part of the consultant team that's been working on this project for the past several months. This webinar is part of a series of in-person and online trainings that have been offered around the state, as well as 2 webinars that are being offered by the Department of Ecology between September of 2014 and May of 2015 throughout the state. This webinar and the reference support materials are being funded by the Department of Ecology. I'm going to get us started by giving a brief overview of the overall program, and then we'll review the agenda, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So just covering a couple of logistics, this is a 2-hour webinar, and for those folks, we've muted you all from our end, but if you can also just be sure that you're muted from your end as well, that would be great. So this introduces the project team. There are lots of great firms and great people that have been working on this project since September. Actually, a little bit before September. We got started in the summer of 2014. As I mentioned, Cascadia Consulting Group, we've got Veda Environmental, CPD Solutions, Herrera, and then also the Association of Washington Cities, who's been instrumental in our outreach and delivery and creation of materials to elected officials and planning commissioners, public works directors. This introduces the instructors for the day. My name is Gretchen Muller. I'm a senior associate with Cascadia Consulting Group. We also have Hilary Wilkinson here, who is a principal with Veda Environmental. And then Rebecca Dugopolski is a senior engineer with Herrera. In addition, and the stars of our show today are our 4 panelists. We're really excited about the participation of these panelists, as they've been in the trenches working on the code update process and have a lot of lessons learned and best practices to share with us today. So we've got Pam Emerson, who is the Green Infrastructure Advisor for the City of Seattle's Office of Sustainability and the Environment. She is responsible for developing and implementing strategies to accelerate green stormwater infrastructure retrofits and integrated infrastructure development across a range of project types and contexts. She also supports Seattle Public Utilities' Green Stormwater Infrastructure Capital Program with policy refinement, design, review, and community engagement. Pam is leading the City of Seattle's Low Impact Development Code Integration process, along with coordinating a team of policy experts in stormwater code, land use code, standard plans and specifications, design standards, and fire codes. She holds an MLA, a Master of Landscape Architecture, in Urban Ecological Design from the University of Washington. We also have Merita Trohimovich, who is a professional civil engineer for the City of Tacoma. She has over 20 years of experience in the fields of wastewater and stormwater, and over the last 10 years, her focus has been on stormwater and specifically on the implementation of the NPDES permit requirements. Merita has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Washington. Also joining us today as a panelist is Luanne Coachman. She's an engineer with King County. Luanne passed the Washington State Bar in 1987, and after some time in private practice, she began working for King County in 1991, primarily doing SEPA appeals. In 1997, she began managing the county's Phase 1 municipal stormwater permit, as well as coordinating compliance activities. Since 2009, she has been working on special projects related to stormwater and permit compliance, and one of those projects was the LID code review and revision update. And our final panelist is Don Anderson, who is a civil engineer as well as the Low Impact Development Specialist for Pierce County Public Works. She has over 30 years of experience in the civil engineering field and has been with Pierce County for 22 years. She is currently Pierce County's Low Impact Development Specialist and a project manager in Pierce County's Surface Water Management Division. So I want to welcome our panelists and thank them in advance for their time and participation during this webinar. So giving you a quick overview of the program before we go ahead and get started. The new Municipal Stormwater National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or as we all know it as the NPDES general permits, they require widespread adoption of the low impact development techniques into local development codes. And these new practices and codes require significant changes in the way the private development community plans, designs, and builds sites, as well as the way the public sector enforces, operates, maintains, and inspects stormwater facilities. So to help jurisdictions comply with the new NPDES permits, the Washington State Department of Ecology has been offering 8 low-impact development code update and integration trainings throughout the state. And these have been in-person trainings, and we actually concluded the last in-person training in March. These trainings have been designed to help both Western Washington Phase 2 jurisdictions update and revise their codes to require and allow for the use of LID. And in Eastern Washington, these trainings have been providing an opportunity for Phase 2 jurisdictions to voluntarily update their codes and to better understand how to incorporate LID into future projects. So as you can see on the slide, the distribution, the geographic distribution of the trainings, the in-person trainings, as well as the 2 webinars. And the webinar today for Phase 2 jurisdictions concludes our in-person and online training series for this program. The goal of the webinar is to equip Phase 2 jurisdictions throughout Washington with the knowledge and tools needed to update their codes and regulations. So the goal really is to provide clear, relevant, and directly applicable knowledge and tools so that Phase 2 jurisdictions are in compliance with the NPDES Municipal Stormwater Permit requirements. We've got several webinar learning objectives today. The first learning objective is to clarify permit requirements and timelines, and we'll cover this during the overview of permit requirements section of the agenda. The second and third objective, the second objective being review the process and responsibilities, so roles and responsibilities, as well as providing 6 steps to the low-impact development code update and integration process. These 2 objectives will be covered in the 6 steps to LID integration sections of the agenda. The fourth bullet, or fourth objective, is to provide solutions to challenges and barriers. We'll cover this in the barriers and solutions discussion with our panelists. And the final training objective number 5, is to discuss opportunities for ongoing support. And we'll discuss this during the wrap-up and evaluation section of the agenda. So here we've got the agenda. As I mentioned, the first section of the agenda will be an overview of the permit requirements. Then we'll move into the 6 steps to low-impact development integration. And there are 6 steps total. We'll first discuss steps 1 through 3. And then we'll get into the potential barriers and solutions. Then we'll discuss steps 4 through 6. And then the final section of the agenda is a wrap-up and evaluation. And we'll be hearing from the panelists at the end of step 3. We'll be hearing from the panelists after about potential barriers and solutions, and we'll be also hearing from the panelists after step 6. And they'll be speaking about their experiences, lessons learned, and best practices as they relate to each of the steps that we go over during this webinar. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Dugopolski with Herrera Environmental, and she'll be going over the overview of permit requirements.
So I'm sure a lot of you have seen this slide or something similar to this slide before, but I'd like to start off with this one because it just provides the context for who are the permittees in the state of Washington. We have 7 Phase 1 permittees, 2 cities and 4 counties, and a lot of those are with us today on our panelists. In Western Washington, we have 82 cities and 5 counties that are Phase 2 permittees, and in Eastern Washington, we have 18 cities and 5 counties that are Phase 2 permittees. So when you're looking at these requirements, just know there's a lot of others that are faced with similar requirements, and there's a lot of groups out there, people working together and sharing tools and approaches to things to help get you through some of these permit requirements. So that's kind of the overview of who's covered by the permit. In Western Washington, the requirement is in section S5C4F of the permit, in the Phase 2 permit. It states that permittees shall review, revise, and make effective their local development-related codes, rules, standards, or other enforceable documents to incorporate and require LID principles and LID BMPs. The intent of the revision shall be to make LID the preferred and commonly used approach to site development. The revision shall be designed to minimize impervious surfaces, native vegetation loss, and stormwater runoff in all types of development solutions. It also states that permittees shall conduct a similar review and revision process and consider the range of issues outlined in Integrating LID into Local Codes, a guidebook for local governments. And that was a document developed by the Puget Sound Partnership in 2012. So the focus of today is looking at these permit requirements related to LID code review. This requirement in the Phase 2 permit is fairly big, and we'll be talking about that in a minute, but it does require substantial investment of staff time to meet this requirement. Also note that the permit itself specifically references that local guidebook for local governments. And so that's the reason why this training and the structure of our toolkit is closely tied to the structure that's outlined in that guidebook. So that's the reason for the 6 steps that we're talking about today. Also, as part of the permit requirement, along with that review and revision process, you also have to submit a summary of the results of the review and revision process. This is also in that same permit section. So you're submitting a summary of the results of the review and revision process. And that should include a list of people who participated in the review and revision process, and you would want to list their job title, brief job description, and the department that they represent, the codes, rules, standards, and other enforceable documents that you reviewed, and then a summary of the revisions made to those documents to incorporate and require LID. The timeline for implementing this permit requirement, Phase 1s have been extended slightly. The original deadline was June 30th, 2015, but they've got a little more time depending on when comments came back from ecology on their manuals. Most of the Phase 2 permittees are aiming for this December 31st, 2016 deadline, and note that that is both review and adopting changes to your code. So when you're looking at December 2016, that may seem like a long ways off, but that process does take a while to actually get through adoption. For Lewis and Cowlitz County, a slightly longer timeline. That's June 30th, 2017. New permittees, the City of Linden and City of Snoqualmie, have until the end of December 2017, and City of Aberdeen has all the way until June 30th, 2018. And the reason for that is tied to Growth Management Act updates, so that's the reason why some permittees have a slightly longer timeline, and also for new permittees because they're just implementing their new program, and so they have a little more time as well to incorporate that. Along with that, there's also a summary report that I mentioned, some of the requirements for that, and that's due in March of the following year after your timeline for review and revising your codes. In Eastern Washington, the requirements are a little more vague than Western Washington. Western Washington has a more prescriptive approach in terms of what you need to take a look at. In Eastern Washington, Section S5B5-2A of the permit states that all permittees shall implement a policy of encouraging project proponents to maintain natural drainages to the maximum extent possible, including reducing the total amount of impervious surfaces created by the project. No later than December 31st, 2017, permittees shall allow non-structural preventative actions and source reduction approaches such as low-impact development techniques, measures to minimize the creation of impervious surfaces, and measures to minimize the disturbance of native soils and vegetation. And it also notes that provisions for LID should take into account site conditions and long-term maintenance. So here the key thing is they shall allow, whereas in Western Washington, you're reviewing and revising to make LID the preferred and commonly used approach. The timelines in Eastern Washington are looking at December 31st, 2017, as I mentioned, so that's the timeline for allowing those LID techniques and measures to minimize impervious surfaces, and then a summary of the criteria defining feasibility or a citation for the criteria adopted pursuant to a regional low-impact development manual. That's in March 31st of 2018 as part of the annual report. So reporting requirements are also quite different in Eastern Washington. So just looking at infeasibility, but not necessarily documenting the whole process of code review and update.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. And now we are moving into introducing the first of the 3 steps to the 6 steps of LID integration. And getting us started on step 1 is Hilary Wilkinson from Veda Environmental.
Thanks, Gretchen. So we are at the portion of the agenda where we're going to really dive into the weeds and talk about the 6 steps to LID integration. We're going to start with the first 3, and then we're going to give our panelists some time to respond, and then we'll move on to the next 3 and have our panelists respond again. But what I'm going to do right now is just give a very quick overview of what those 6 steps are and give just a tiny bit of context. We obviously don't have time in this webinar to go into a whole lot of detail, so we'll really be giving the broad brush strokes, but there is a lot of detail about each of these 6 steps contained in the low impact development code update and integration toolkit. That toolkit was sent, oops, wait, where did it go? Go down. Yeah, okay, sorry. The toolkit that you see, you'll see the cover of it in the lower right-hand corner of the slide that's up right now, and you also received a link to this toolkit when you signed up for this webinar. And this toolkit has a whole lot more information about each of these 6 steps. These 6 steps, as Rebecca mentioned, were really designed to kind of help demystify the process of updating your codes and integrating them. And they are built upon the foundation of some previous work that was done by the Puget Sound Partnership, which is that guidebook that's in that, also on the slide, the white guidebook there. So 6 steps, I'm going to quickly tell you what they are. The first step is assemble the project team, and I'm going to be talking briefly about that. The second step is really understanding what general topics you want to address as you do your update, and Rebecca will be speaking to that step. The third step is reviewing your existing codes and standards, and Rebecca, again, will be speaking to that step. Step 4 is amending your existing codes and developing new codes, and you'll be hearing from Rebecca again on that step. And then step 5 is the public review and adoption process, and Gretchen will be speaking to that step. And step 6 is moving from updates to implementation. So those are the 6 steps, and again, much more detail about them in the toolkit. One thing to mention also is that for each of these 6 steps, there's an estimated time frame, kind of the approximate time that each of these steps might take your jurisdiction. These time frames are sort of based on jurisdictions that have already blazed this path ahead of you, and sort of how much time it took them. So you'll be seeing that for each of the steps. So without further ado, I'm going to move us into step 1, which is assemble the project team. And in the lower right-hand corner of this slide, you'll see that the estimate for this time is 1 to 3 months. And assembling the project team is, identified as the first step because it, like any project that has lots of nuances like updating codes, you need a really solid team to make sure that it's successful. So quite a bit of thought has been given to give some advice and guidance on how you might assemble that project team to help improve your chances of being successful in this project. It's really going to take a comprehensive team, both of internal folks as well as external folks, to get this kind of ball all the way down the field through the public adoption process that we'll be talking about later. So the way we are going to talk about it right now is first speaking to who should be on your internal team. And your internal team is really the people within your jurisdiction who are going to be doing kind of the in-the-weeds, looking at your codes and actually making recommendations to how to update them and revise them. Your external team are the folks kind of external to your jurisdiction, including key stakeholders who can provide critical feedback and are really important to kind of helping facilitate your adoption process. So just briefly on the internal team, there's really 4 key departments that have been identified as being very critical to involve in your code integration update process, and they are the big blue bubbles that you see on this slide: the planning department, the public works department, fire and public safety, and the building department. And within each of those different departments, we've also identified kind of who are the key people and or teams that would be important to tap to be involved. So for planning, it's development review, construction inspection. For the building department, it's policy, inspection, and review. And you all can see the rest of them on the slide. But it's very, very important at the beginning of your process to really think about who are the different departments, and within each of those departments, who are the different entities and teams that will be really important to getting this through. LID is a very comprehensive, cross-cutting, multidisciplinary issue that touches lots and lots of different people, and that's one of the reasons why thinking it through at the outset is a really good idea. I'm going to now move on to the external team, and then we're going to be hearing from our panelists later on some advice that they have about each of these two teams, your internal and external team. So again, the external team are the folks who are going to be important to providing critical input as well as helping you shepherd through a public adoption process. And this slide shows you a few of those entities, individuals, organizations that others who have done this process before have found to be very important to involve at some stage of the game. They range from agencies that own and maintain streets. So, for example, if you're going to change your street width standards, you're going to need to really involve agencies that own and maintain streets, to your state local health department, to special districts, to environmental groups, and definitely to major property owners and developers. Citizens and neighborhood groups and utility providers. These are all sort of entities and organizations and individuals that have been identified as really important to think about how you're going to engage them and give them opportunities to sort of give you feedback as you start to identify what codes you want to update. So finally, in this step one, this next slide has the title Understanding of LID. We have this here because one of the most important things to remember as you're starting this process and you're convening your team and you're getting the right people at the table is that everyone comes into this process with very different levels of understanding of what low impact development is. And we highly recommend that your very first task is to make sure everybody is truly on the same page, that they understand what low impact development is, what its intention is, that it's an integration of engineered small scale stormwater controls, all these things. Gretchen previously mentioned that a key team member in this effort is the Association of Washington Cities, and on their website they have a lot of fantastic kind of LID 101 materials that are great for this kind of getting everybody on the same page, and we highly recommend that you check out what some of those materials are. They have slideshows, presentations, videos, all kinds of things that you could just kind of bring to a meeting and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that is the conclusion of step one, which is convening your project team. And now I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca Dugopolski, who you've already heard from, who's going to talk about step two.
So yeah, once you have your project team together, step one, and a common level of understanding of LID, the next step is to really establish your work program that identifies topics and subtopics that you need to review and update to help integrate LID into your codes. And you'll notice the time frame for this is also set at about 1 to 3 months. Looking back at the NPDES reporting requirements in the Western Washington permit, there are 3 main review categories, and you'll notice in the toolkit there's these 3 different symbols associated with those. The first is measures to minimize impervious surfaces, so you'll see a little road symbol for that. Measures to minimize loss of native vegetation, a little pine tree there. And then other measures to minimize stormwater runoff is a rain cloud. And so those symbols are really to help you organize your summary report to ecology into those 3 review categories. And so you'll notice that those are scattered throughout the toolkit. In Eastern Washington, since you don't have that same reporting requirement, you don't need to necessarily categorize things into those groupings, but it is important to know which part of the permit that ties back to, since there is a lot of overlap there. So now that you have your team together and you have your review categories, you need to understand and decide what general topics to address. And there's a lot of topics that are out there in the universe, so how do you really hone in on what are those topics that you should be taking a look at as part of this review? A lot of this is outlined in the guidebook that was developed previously, and so we've looked at these major topics and then also working in subtopics associated with those. So if you have the toolkit or take a look at the toolkit later, this is summarized in Table 1 on page 9 of the toolkit, and it outlines these 12 major topics. And it's important that you review these 12 topics. You can also add topics that are relevant to your jurisdiction. You can regroup things in a different way if you want to, but these really help you think about all the different topics that might be associated with LID and things that you need to take a look at as part of your process. So on this first slide here, you'll see things that are very broad, such as site planning and assessment. Healthy soils is a little more specific. Landscaping, native vegetation, and street landscaping, that one can also be a pretty broad topic that's could be scattered throughout your code or focused in one section of your code. Hard and impervious surfaces here is one that kind of overlaps with some later categories. Generally, we think of this as kind of just your impervious surface if you have any limits on those or anything like that, and then we get into more specifics about streets and roads and parking requirements later on. So those are the first 4 major topics. The next 4 include bulk and dimensional considerations, clearing and grading, and here I talked about impervious surfaces. Now we focus more on streets and roads and also parking. And then the final 4 look at design guidelines and standards, and this one's pretty broad, but you could fold in things here such as bioretention, green roofs, vegetated roofs, rainwater harvesting if you have specific guidelines and standards for those. A lot of jurisdictions also have their own standard plans and specifications that are being reviewed as part of this process. Stormwater management and maintenance, that's an important topic to take a look at in relation to LID. And at the end, we have subdivision and plan unit development, as well as critical areas and shoreline management. And just to give you a quick screenshot of what's included in that table 1, so within each of these major topics, here you see site planning and assessment, healthy soils, landscaping, and hard and impervious surfaces. And you'll notice there that it's not always cut and dry which category that these fall into. So for site planning and assessment, that really covers all 3 review topics. Healthy soils is focused mainly on the third topic, the rain cloud there. Landscaping, native vegetation, obviously tied to landscaping. And hard and impervious surfaces, again, is one that overlaps into multiple categories. So it can be tricky to figure out how to organize that report to ecology, but there is a lot of overlap between some of these topics. And again, I mentioned this is table 1, and it's on page 9 of your toolkit. And you'll notice at the bottom of each of those sections, add subtopic as necessary. So you can add other subtopics. During our in-person training sessions, we had kind of a brainstorming to add additional subtopics there, so that's something you may want to think about doing with your team as well. And here are just the screenshots of the rest of table 1 here. And you'll notice under streets and roads, quite a few different subtopics there, and the rest of the list. I also wanted to mention, starting on page 24 of the toolkit, there's something that we're calling subtopics focus sheets, and I think these are really critical tables to really think about each of those subtopics. So you've got your general category, landscaping, that's very broad. And then subtopic is tree preservation. So along with tree preservation, we've included some things. Why is this topic important? Why are trees important in relation to stormwater? And then what are some things I should think about or questions I should consider during my review? And so this is just an example of one of those bullets, but for each of these subtopics, we have several bullets to think about during your review process. So hopefully that'll help you as part of your review. So shifting next to step 3. So now you have a list of topics that you want to address, you have your team together, and next you need to know where these topics occur in your policies, codes, and enforceable documents, so you can take a look at where those topics come up and if there's anything that need to be changed as part of that. If you still have your 2011 annual report, you may remember there was, back in that report, there was barriers to LID that you identified as part of your codes and documents, so you may want to dig that up and take a look at that. There may be some other planning you've already done that you want to incorporate into this process. And the timeline for this, again, is 1 to 3 months. So these first 3 steps are similar in terms of timeline. So the first thing in determining where is putting together a list of the codes, rules, standards, and enforceable documents that you would like to take a look at. In the guidebook and also in the toolkit on page 11, there's a list of different code sections and documents that you should consider reviewing. It's not necessarily a list you have to review all these. You may not actually have all of them as part of your jurisdiction's codes and documents, but there are examples there, such as your comprehensive or planning documents, that first bullet there, looking at things like a stormwater comprehensive or management plan, And also, if you have a city or county-wide comprehensive plan, that's also a good thing to take a look at, the goals and policies included within that. Your standard details, I mentioned that several jurisdictions do have standard plans and specifications. For some cities, you may have those for multiple departments as well. So you want to take a look at not just the ones that are related to stormwater, but the ones that are also related to road design as well. Engineering and street standards, development design guidelines and requirements, and then that final bullet, zoning, development, and subdivision code, that could be a huge slew of different codes. So some of the things that are listed in the toolkit that you may want to take a look at, some jurisdictions have a specific street and sidewalk use code, stormwater code, definitely your land use code, building code, mechanical code, and plumbing code. Those could be tied to things such as rainwater harvesting, vegetated roofs, so you want to make sure that that's allowable as part of your code. Your subdivision code, grading code, fire code. You may have a specific low-impact development code already, so taking a look at that. Tree and vegetation management requirements, landscaping requirements, and right-of-way requirements. So it's quite the list of potential code sections you could take a look at. It's not necessarily your full code, but a lot of different sections LID does touch on. There's also a table in the toolkit on page 12 that lists some LID considerations. So when you're taking a look at those different documents, here are the examples for comprehensive or planning documents, and some of the things that you should take a look at as part of those. For comprehensive plans, your goals and policies should promote LID. Goals and policies that present barriers to LID should be modified or removed. Policies that support dual use of landscaping or open space and LID should be added. And policies should also support minimizing impervious areas. And this is just an example for comprehensive and planning documents, but you can take a look at each of those categories of documents that I mentioned earlier and what some of the LID considerations are as part of that. Also, as part of the toolkit, this is on page 16, there's a review form, and there's also a Word version of the review form, so you can take that and modify that and fill that out for use in your jurisdiction and your review. And this is just zoomed in on step 3, so identifying where the gaps are. If a gap has been identified, yes, no, does not apply. There's a spot to put your section or page reference, a spot to summarize the existing code language, and also documenting any conflicts or gaps. And we've also found that sometimes it's helpful to put a recommendation or something to consider in that conflict gaps column, so when you get to the next step of actually updating your codes, there's a recommendation or at least a thought there of something you should consider. And this form can be modified to incorporate those additional subtopics that we talked about earlier. Maybe you want to group things in a different way in your jurisdiction, but it really kind of helps you walk through each of those topics and subtopics, because otherwise you may miss something during your review. So now that you have the review form together, the next important thing is to assign documents to review. We've heard kind of mixed opinions on this. Sometimes it's helpful to have the person that actually wrote the code take a look at the code, and sometimes it's helpful to have someone who is not as familiar with the code to actually review that section, because they may catch other things that the person that actually wrote the code wasn't intending to add a barrier for LID or anything like that. So it may be helpful to at least have a couple different people, but at least a lead for each document on the list. Also very helpful to meet with others on your team to discuss the review results. So you've got 1 or 2 people that are really combing through the code and finding those gaps, and then discussing that with your team and how to proceed and how to move forward. Also, finalizing your review forms based on input from your team. So if you've identified something that isn't really a gap, making sure you update that for your final documentation. And then consider presenting your results at this stage to your council or external stakeholders if you want to keep them informed along the way. And these steps are outlined on page 13 of the toolkit. There's kind of check boxes there, so you can walk through the rest of these steps as part of step 3. All right, so next we'll get some input from our panelists on steps 1 through 3, and I think Hilary's going to lead us through that.
Yeah, so Hilary again here, and we have built in some time to have our fantastic panelists address some specific questions that we've pulled together related to all of the steps. We're going to start with steps 1 through 3, and I'm going to facilitate this. We have about a little over 20 minutes for this piece, and So we're going to ask a couple of our panelists a couple questions about step one. And again, step one was the assemble your project team step. And the first question we have is, do you have advice or lessons learned regarding critical internal and external members of the code implementation team? And Pam Emerson with the City of Seattle, I'm going to call on you first to address this question. Pam?
Sure, thank you. A few suggestions here. One suggestion is to be sure and include an executive champion and or champions if you have a large jurisdiction. Our executive champion was the director of Seattle Public Utilities because Seattle Public Utilities is the keeper of our NPDES permit. So we used kind of a top-down and bottom-up approach in assembling our team. The top-down piece, I think, was critical. So a letter went out from the director of our utility to all directors of all affected departments, highlighting the need to assign staff to this work. And that, I think, helped pave the way for us to assemble our team. And then sort of the bottom-up piece, we started with our existing NPDES coordinators in various departments. I'm not sure if that is something that transfers over to smaller jurisdictions, but we have existing NPDES coordinators in some of our larger departments, our planning department, our transportation department, and our drainage utility. So those were our first go-to team members, and then sort of the next level down within those departments, we relied on those NPDES coordinators to also identify experts in the various codes. So, for example, our NPDES coordinator in our planning department may or may not was not really a land use code expert, but was able to bring in a land use code expert into our team. And then just two other suggestions in answer to this question. One is to also think about engaging legal counsel if you have a law office in your jurisdiction. We also did work with legal counsel to help us make sense and interpret some of the permit language so that we are applying that language consistently across all departments. And then I would also encourage you to think about a chief cat herder. That is my role in the process. Someone who's not necessarily in the weeds of actually doing any of the code review, but is riding herd on the entire process and making sure that folks are clear on timeline, folks are making progress, staying on the critical path, dealing with staff changes, dealing with differences of opinion in terms of what the requirement actually means, someone who's tracking the entire process. So those are my recommendations in terms of assembling your team.
That's great, Pam. Thank you so much for that. And just for everybody on the webinar, I know many of you are from smaller phase 2 jurisdictions, and our panelists represent much larger jurisdictions. We've really asked them to kind of think about the kind of things that would also be applicable to smaller jurisdictions. We recognize every jurisdiction is of a different size and scale and different staffing capacities and titles of departments and things like that. So, kind of use that filter as you think about what you're hearing from our larger jurisdiction panelists here. But that was great, Pam. Thanks so much. Luanne Coachman from King County is also offered to address this first question. Any advice or lessons learned about kind of that step one critical project team member? So, Luanne?
Essentially, Pam's recommendations are very consistent with what we found in King County that we needed to do, both top-down, executive level, leaning on staff, and then the bottom-up, we will also have a series of permit leads who helped us identify key players. One thing we learned is that not everyone is excited about NPDES compliance as those of us who have it as part of our job description, and we found that there was heavy institutional resistance to doing this work, and you need to factor that in. You need to add extra time to overcome that resistance. And we found that the chief cat herder, who happens to be me, was also needed to do a lot of the work up front and then present it to the people on the committee, as it were, for comment. That is, the resistance was almost too great to have them actually initiate work, but they were receptive to commenting and critiquing and providing supplemental information. So you may want to make sure that your chief cat herder, or maybe you have co-cat herders, are fully empowered in terms of having the time assigned to them to be able to do a good portion of the work and then run it by everyone else.
Great. Is that it, Luanne? Well, thank you so much, Pam and Luanne. That's really helpful. I heard a couple themes there. Having kind of a cat herder at the helm, professional cat herder, I think, to really, kind of oversee, keep people accountable, hold people accountable with timeline. Having an executive champion, it sounds like, is also very important. So thank you for sharing those great insights. Really appreciate it. We are going to move on to question 2, and this question also relates to step 1, which is the assemble your project team. And this question is for Merita, and the question is, describe your strategies and recommendations for involving stakeholders who have expressed reservations about LID. We just heard about kind of internal team members who have some reservations. This question is about the kind of external folks who have some reservations and strategies that you all employed that helped you overcome that. So, Merita?
So I'm going to talk maybe about internal and external people who both may have reservations. And I think a lot of the reservations to LID come from just not completely understanding the subject matter and knowing what we're talking about when we're talking about LID for NPDES permit compliance. So education is really the key. And I would definitely suggest that everyone goes to Ecology's LID website. They have a lot of great information. They have handouts. They have PowerPoints. I took a couple of their PowerPoints and just revised them slightly to meet the needs of Tacoma, and then went ahead and presented those to my internal group. And it just really got everybody on the same page. Like, when we're thinking about this project, what is the actual requirement from Ecology? And because a lot of people, when they think about LID, they're thinking that, we're going to require everybody to harvest rainwater and things like that. And while those things are great, they aren't necessarily going to be a requirement. So just explain to them what is LID, why it's beneficial, explain the permit mandate clearly, and show them what we already have that is LID and how it's already working. Because many jurisdictions already have LID, or maybe your neighbors already have LID, so you could take them to see this LID stuff that's already in the ground and working well. Another suggestion would be to have them attend some of the free Ecology LID trainings, particularly the introductory ones, just to get them hearing it from several places. As Luanne said, people who aren't doing NPDES compliance every day aren't as excited about it as those who are. And so if they hear it from different sources, I think it can be really beneficial. And then, I guess I kind of hit on this before, but just show examples. Have a tour of LID facilities that are already in the ground and already working well, so that they can actually see them and know what they're talking about.
Great. Okay, thanks, Merita. I think that was excellent, and that sort of touched on what we spoke about earlier about kind of getting your project team on the same page of what LID is. She spoke to all the resources that are available on the Department of Ecology website that can help you do that. I love the idea of doing a show and tell, going out, getting people looking at functioning LID facilities so they really understand what they are, and then going to a lot of the free trainings that Ecology is putting on right now around LID so that they're hearing it from multiple sources. So thank you, Merita, for addressing that question. And with that, we are going to move on to the question that we pulled together for step number 2. And again, step number 2 is understanding the general topics to address. And the question that we have, and this is again for Merita, the question is, what topics and subtopics that were not covered in this PowerPoint presentation did you find useful to add to your review process at the City of Tacoma?
I think this is the trick question because you guys came up with this really huge, comprehensive list, which is pretty much encompasses everything. The things that I think you need to think about that might not be on this list directly are the not the exact code itself, but the other regulatory documents that you have and or maybe don't have, and is not having other documents a barrier to LID. And that's one of the things in Tacoma that we really decided could be a barrier to LID is the fact that we have lots of standard details on how to build roads and sidewalks and things like that, but we don't have any right now on how to build pervious roads and pervious sidewalks, and that is a huge barrier for developers. They want something that they know is going to be quick and easy and is already has buy-off by the regulatory community so that they can quickly get their process through that permit and ready to build. So that's really important. Also, standard specs. When we first had one of our first LID pervious roads come in, because we weren't really sure how they were going to build it and we wanted to make sure that everything was going to work great, we required them to submit their specs for that. And typically for a standard road, we would not require someone to submit their spec for the actual road materials and the asphalt. But we did, and that could be a barrier. So if you're going to require something extra for an LID project, you really need to make sure that you think that through. And am I creating a barrier by requiring this extra thing? Because it's more work for people, and that's going to make them want to back away from the process. Also, you need to look for consistency between all your regulatory documents. Look everywhere in your code for very vague references that might prohibit LID. One thing that I've seen is a code that says continuous curbing is required around all parking lots. How do you get the parking lot to drain to a surrounding bioretention if there's a requirement for continuous curb? So then you would have to ask for a variance. That's a barrier. Also, look everywhere. I guess I just said that, but look everywhere. Look in the building code. There could be some obscure hidden reference about getting a special variance for infiltration. And in your critical areas codes, what we've done is in our review of our codes, if there's a listing of things that are allowed, say for landscaping features, and it says you can have plants, you can have certain amenities. If there's a listing, we have included that you can have a vegetated stormwater facility, just so that when people are reading that code, they know right away, yes, we can do it here. We don't have to ask for special clearance, and the regulatory permit reviewers see it in there. They don't wonder. It's consistent every time. So we've really made sure that we're putting those words in the code where it's appropriate.
Great. Thank you, Merita. That was very helpful, and I think if there's a theme in this, it's, think beyond the toolkit and some of the topics that have been identified in this PowerPoint presentation, and think about all the different ways that your existing documents or lack of documents may create barriers to people trying to pursue LID. So thank you for sharing all of that. And this kind of helps us move into our next question, which is related to step 3. And again, step 3 is review. This is the step where you're actually reviewing your existing codes and standards, and we've covered a little bit of this already. But the question is directed at Pam again. And Pam, the question is, what codes and documents that were not listed in this presentation did you end up reviewing at City of Seattle That's it. That's my question.
Great, thank you. Yeah, before I answer that, I just want to underscore one thing that Merita said that I'm in enthusiastic agreement with, and that is to not only think about the process as removing barriers, but also inserting supportive guidance and supportive language, and design planning ideas to site developers. So, for example, in our fire code, there are specifications for how wide a lane has to be for buildings for fire truck access to buildings that are not close to a fire hydrant, and that you might not immediately interpret as a barrier to LID, but we did see an opportunity there to be explicit that entry access lane could be permeable pavement, and so to kind of plant the idea in the designer developer's brain, oh, here's an opportunity to apply LID principles. So just wanted to underscore, I thought Merita made a really good point about that. In terms of codes and documents that are not listed necessarily in the toolkit, but that you might consider, again, this is, I think, really specific to by jurisdiction, but some of the things that we found, we looked at historic preservation code. We looked also at our grading code. In some places, grading code might be integrated into stormwater code or integrated into building code. We also, a couple of our larger capital departments have their own internal design guidance, design standards. So our public utility has its own design standards, and so does our parks department. So we looked at those documents. Those are separate from citywide standard plans and specifications. We also looked at our pavement opening and restoration rule. Again, in some jurisdictions, this might be integrated into your right-of-way improvement manual or a like document. And then lastly, we looked at some documents that are, in Seattle, they're called client assistance memos. They're not technically enforceable documents. They're meant to be, as the name implies, sort of a layperson interpretation of code that helps people find their way to the relevant code and make sense of it. However, in some cases, they read as enforceable documents because they, for example, may include lists of things you can and can't do, or may include a summary of setback requirements and that sort of information. So we looked at some CAMs that related to stormwater code, for example, in land use code, to look at that language that reads like as if it is as if it is an enforceable document, and also to make sure that those client assistance memos are what they say are consistent with the code updates that we're making as well. So if the client assistance memo is pointing to a code, that we're also updating in the process to make sure that those references are current.
Great. Thank you so much, Pam. Okay, so we're moving on to our second question for step 3, and again, step 3 is this, review existing codes and standards. And two of our panelists are going to address this question. Dawn is going to kick us off first, and then I'll turn to Pam. And the question is, did you develop a specific review form to track your process? And if so, what modifications would you make to the form to help facilitate your review process? So, Dawn, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to use pretty much what's in the toolkit. However, we're going to add the code number so we know 18A, 17B, and also who's responsible for it. So, like say for the road standards, that would be 17B, road standards, and it'd be the county engineer who is the person who's responsible, quote unquote, to make the required changes, or you can say the owner of the code. That's the only thing that I've come across so far, and we're doing that just to keep it easier so we know who's responsible for what code it's in, and also where, maybe we need to tweak it somewhere else. We might have some road standards in the storm manual, so on and so forth.
Great. Okay, Pam, do you want to add to anything that Dawn said?
Well, we added leading questions into our review form, and I think the new Phase 2 sample review form has those leading questions as well. If it doesn't, I think that was a useful step. In terms of a modification, the one thing I would mention is that we tried to use the review form also as use it as a twofer, so looking sort of down the timeline to where our overall city NPDES coordinator was going to have to be compiling information from all these different places into a final report to ecology. We asked each of our lead people to be using the review form also as a reporting instrument, so that we would have a consistent reporting instrument and to make the workload lighter on the back end later down the road when we had to compile our final report. I think that one modification I would make to that in hindsight is that has worked out pretty well for the large code. So for land use code, stormwater code, where it's a large document that we're reviewing, we're going through each of the questions methodically, and we'll have one reporting instrument at the end. For where it didn't work as well was in places like reviewing our own internal parks design guidelines, where that's actually many documents, or you could think of it as one document with many volumes or many chapters, most of which don't apply to this review, but there might be one or two things in each of those documents or each of those chapters that does. And so we ended up with a kind of clunky process where we had a sort of very long, comprehensive review form, only a few topics from which, were really relevant for those individual design chapters. So in that case, what we ended up doing was giving that reviewer more flexibility and latitude to simply do inline changes in those documents and save those versions, so we could document our process and our for the programmatic requirement, and then use the review form / reporting instrument more as a summary document for the entire body of work. So that's one thing we learned along the way.
That's great. I think it deserves to be underscored again, is just, the idea of the review form could potentially save some time down the line in terms of using it as part of your reporting instrument to ecology. But I think I'm hearing from you, Pam, to be careful that it may not be appropriate for some of the smaller codes, that land use code, the bigger codes is appropriate, but kind of the smaller ones, you might want to be a little more flexible in your review and do line item changes and things like that. So thank you for that. That was very helpful. Thank you to Dawn as well. And with that concludes our first sort of panelist round robin Q&A for steps 1 through 3. I'm handing the baton back to Gretchen, and we are now moving into our potential barriers and solutions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Hilary. Yes, as in any multi-step process, and by now we've gone through steps 1 through 3, so we've talked about, who should be on the team, assembling your project team, who do you want at the table, both internally and externally. We've talked about step 2, which is understanding the general topics to address, so that's that what question and that universe, narrowing down that universe. Then we've moved into step 3, which is reviewing the existing codes and standards, so where do you start? Needing to roll up your sleeves, where do you start? So we've gone through those first 3 steps, and before we launch into the final 3 steps for this webinar, we realized that this multi-step process involves both external as well as internal stakeholders, and as I mentioned, is a multi-step process. So as in any multi-step process, there are potential barriers, and so we've asked the panelists to speak to some of these barriers that they've encountered during their code review process and how they address them. And what we've decided to do is ask them to talk to process challenges and solutions, and then also ask our panelists to talk to some technical opportunities that they have identified throughout their code update process. So first I'm asking Luanne to kick us off with the process challenges. Sorry about that. Potential barriers and solutions. So I'm asking Luanne to speak to process challenges and solutions that folks over at King County have experienced in this process.
So this is a review of resistance to doing the work. It's a huge barrier. And the best solution was to minimize the requirement that other people initiate work, but put them in the position of reviewing work. So that meant a big role for the person who was the official lead on the project, but it just made everything easier. It reduced stress all around. So that's our biggie.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much, Luanne. And now I'd like to hear from Pam on some of the process challenges and solutions to your process at City of Seattle.
I'm sorry, I got lost for a second. Process challenges and solutions. I think I mentioned this briefly in passing a moment ago, but I think it's worth underscoring because the process is so long, or can be so long. You may encounter attrition. So you may have people who are really up to speed finally on what the task at hand is, and hopefully even supportive and enthusiastic about making the changes, and then their job may change, or they may have management support and have time in their workload to to do the work, but their management might change and decide that they're needed elsewhere. So again, that's, I think, a critical role for that cat herder person to be tracking that and checking in regularly. We have quarterly meetings, but I also had individual check-ins with each of the main point people for the different departments. So I think I would just underscore that because the process is long, attrition can be an issue.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pam. And now Merita from City of Tacoma.
Right. So I'll be talking a little bit about assembling that team. The first thing to do is to start early. Figure out who you need and start that as early as you can, and be flexible with your requests of who is on your team. A lot of jurisdictions have many projects going on all at the same time, and you can get people just tapped out and overwhelmed, and so you have to be flexible enough to, accept the next person if somebody's busy. Especially in a larger organization, you need to, as we've talked about before, enlist the help of upper management. So figure out who you need on your team, sometimes specific names, or, I need someone from planning, please give me one of the following, and have your upper management talk to their upper management if you need to do that, just to make sure that everybody's on board with the effort that's going to be needed, and they understand that someone from their group is needing to put in that effort. And yeah, that's the big thing. It can take literally months to get a team of 15 people all identified.
Excellent. Thanks, Merita. Yeah, so from Luanne, Pam, and Merita, we heard a common theme, which is really starting early. I think when you look at that timeline, it seems as if there's a lot of time for this process, and really getting started early because each of the steps, and as the panelists mentioned, getting the team together, it can take time. And as Pam mentioned, that because the process can take some time, there can be some staffing changes. So making sure that you're building into your schedule, your project schedule, quarterly meetings and individual check-ins to make sure that the process continues to move forward. And we heard from Luanne that the lack of enthusiasm, and there can be some institutional resistance to doing this work. So again, allowing yourself enough time to get folks on board, and making sure that cat herder is ready to go and is pulling those folks together at key junctures throughout the process. So thank you all very much. And now I'd like to invite our panelists to speak on behalf of any technical opportunities. So you all have been diving into your codes and seeing some of the code language that is a potential barrier to the implementation and integration of low-impact development. So I'd love to hear from Pam, Luanne, and Merita about some technical opportunities that you all identified during the code update process thus far. And I'll start with Pam over at City of Seattle.
Yeah, and I think I was going to talk about what we found, something we weren't expecting to find an opportunity in fire code, and I already mentioned that. So that was just to reiterate that, even where there wasn't necessarily an existing barrier, there was still an opportunity to be really explicit that using a low-impact development approach is an option.
Excellent. Thanks, Pam. And now hearing from Luanne about some technical opportunities that she identified over at King County.
We found, actually, mercifully, that in the process of updating our codes for the Growth Management Act and Critical Areas Ordinance a few years ago, we had added all kinds of wonderful LID stuff. So that was a great chance for us. Those of you who may be in that process, it's a great opportunity, as people are saying, a twofer, our integrated GMA LID process. Another technical opportunity is actually presented by Jessica Knickerbocker at the City of Tacoma. One of the big issues is having a good standard for permeable pavement. It really is important to have these standard details, and a standard permeable pavement spec has been missing. And Jessica Knickerbocker has been working on putting it together. So in a group, if you're interested in joining the discussion with Jessica, get in touch with her at the City of Tacoma, and stay tuned. I think that their announcement of a spec is imminent, so stay tuned for that.
Excellent. Thank you, Luanne. And now Merita on technical opportunities.
So one of the things that we found in our review pretty quickly is that we needed to look at other documents, and it depends on how your code is structured, but for Tacoma, a lot of our regulatory requirements aren't specifically in our code, they're in other documents, and I noticed that I would be needing to update what we call the design manual, and it's for all work within the right-of-way, and so it hadn't been updated since 2004. So we have a standing committee at the City of Tacoma called the Standards Committee, which reviews things like standard specs and details and the design manual. And so I invited that group and expanded it a little bit to do an overhaul of the entire design manual, which everyone got pretty excited about and jumped on board. So now, in addition to some LID updates to the design manual, the entire thing will be updated, which will be a benefit both to city staff and to outside developers.
Excellent. Thank you, Merita. So we've heard from Pam, Luanne, and Merita that there are opportunities that, some unexpected opportunities, like Pam mentioned with the fire code, as well as other opportunities when you are diving into your code update process. And as Luanne mentioned, I think a really great point is there's a lot of great work that's happening regionally and that's happening across the state. And so there's a real opportunity here for cross-collaboration, and really there's no need to recreate the wheel. And so, we're all in this together, and so tapping the great resources that we have around the state, I think is a really good point. So thanks for bringing that up, Luanne. And then Merita mentioned that, through this process, realizing that there was an opportunity to also update the design manual for the right-of-way. And so using this as an opportunity to see, all right, what other resources and materials are out there that really need to be updated too, and doing it at the same time so there's a more streamlined process is a great point. So thank you very much to our panelists for talking about some of the potential challenges and then also opportunities. And now I'm going to move it over to, this gets us into the final 3 steps of the 6 steps to LID integration, and I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to talk about step 4.
Thanks, Gretchen. So step 4 here is actually filling in the gaps. So you've been through this whole process of identifying where there are gaps and barriers in the existing codes, and the next step is really to jump in and determine how to address those gaps. So this is a longer process here. It's 3 to 9 months as identified. Through working with some other jurisdictions, we found that kind of a series of discussion meetings, so where you're meeting to talk about different sections of code or different sections of these enforceable documents are really helpful to really hone in on what changes need to be made and also what things you don't want to change. So as part of this process, one thing that I didn't really mention earlier is that permit language is somewhat vague, so it really allows you to kind of develop your own approach and some flexibility there. We've talked about other code updates and things going on at the same time, so if you can jump on those processes as well and making those, you know, non-LID updates and as well as things that you're looking at in terms of LID. But really the permit requirement is not saying you need to install bioretention on every single project you put in the ground. There's areas where bioretention doesn't work. We all know that. So that's part of the process, is really looking at those infeasibility, technical infeasibility criteria that really don't allow LID to go in certain areas. But what this process is really saying is really identifying and removing those barriers that are making it difficult for developers to put in LID where it actually works and would be a benefit. So in terms of filling in the gap, it's pretty straightforward. The process to address your barriers and gaps, I talked a little bit about the discussion meetings and then discussing some potential solutions. I wanted to just identify a couple examples that we've seen in numerous codes, and one that was also mentioned here today, the continuous curb in parking lots. That's something that we see very frequently in a lot of codes, so really just allowing for curb cuts for water to go into stormwater facilities. Allowing that flexibility there is very important. So that's not saying necessarily that you always have to put in a bioretention facility on every parking lot, but at least have the flexibility to allow for those curb cuts so water can get into those facilities. Another thing I've seen fairly frequently is cement concrete sidewalk. That's pretty standard language that you'll see almost everywhere in terms of installing sidewalks, and it's just not allowing for permeable pavement sidewalks in those situations where that would be feasible for that to actually work. So just modifying the language so you can allow for other types of sidewalk. Cement concrete may still be your preferred material where LID doesn't work, but in other situations allowing that flexibility so you don't have to apply for a variance every time you want to put in a different type of sidewalk. And as we're shifting into these new on-site stormwater management requirements, developers will be required to look at a list of LID BMPs and discuss whether something's feasible or not. So if it is feasible, they're going to have to move in that direction of incorporating that into their design. The next step is updating the review form. We have included this on the review form to reflect actions that were taken. We've kind of split this into different categories that we thought were the most common. So in some cases, you may just be amending your existing code, so red lines to your existing code, tweaking the language, adding a few words here and there. Some of these changes are fairly minimal to just allow that flexibility, and others may be developing new code. We talked a little bit about there may be a section of code that's completely missing. You know, you may not be talking about a particular topic at all, and that's also a gap. So those can sometimes be harder to find, you know, if you're not addressing something at all, versus saying we just need to develop some new code or a new policy to really address this. And then the last one on there is decided not to incorporate any changes, and there's a variety of different reasons for why you may decide not to incorporate changes, and part of this process is really just documenting why you didn't incorporate any changes. So it may be, you know, based on your right-of-way width, you know, this is there for fire safety, this is there for other potential reasons. There's a whole list of other requirements, ADA, things like that. So you'll want to take a look at those and weigh all those requirements into making sure you have access for fire trucks, appropriate turning radius, and things like that. So there may be some changes that you say, well, we looked at our right-of-way widths and our subdivisions and things like that, and the reason for that is we need to be able to have a fire truck get in, turn around, and things like that. So there's a reason for not making any changes there. And this is just a screenshot of that review form. So this is the final column on that review form. It summarizes those steps and what you're taking to fill the gaps. And that's just a screenshot there. And then once you've identified what those are, the next step is really going forward and addressing those gaps with your list of documents. And we've found that to be either creating a separate form where you've got existing language next to your proposed language with red lines and things like that, so you can see exactly what's changed, and then discussing that with a group and really deciding on what the final language will be, and then folding that into your review and update process. So that's just a quick summary on filling in the gaps. Obviously, it can be a long process and a lot of discussion involved there, but just some ideas of how to approach that and how that might work for your jurisdiction. And with that, I'll pass it back to Gretchen to talk about step 5.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rebecca. So now we've gone from step 1, which is assembling your project team, to step 2, understanding the general topics to address, moving into step 3, which is reviewing the existing codes and standards. We've talked about some potential barriers and challenges and solutions. And then Rebecca just talked about step 4, which is amending the existing code and development of new codes, so filling in that gap. And now I'm going to be talking about step 5, which is the review and adoption process, so public review and adoption process. And here, the approximation that we've put in terms of the amount of time that we think that it will take is between 3 to 9 months. But it's really important to know, and I'll get into this in the next slide as well, that every jurisdiction has a different public review and adoption process. So we just have a couple of slides on this, but it's really important as you launch into the code update and integration process to learn what your particular jurisdiction's adoption process is and your jurisdiction's public review process is, and learn the schedule for that adoption process, and then also identify, is there a particular person in your jurisdiction or people in your jurisdiction that are responsible and will help play a big role in this process with you, and making sure that they're aware of this process that you're going through and aware of your timeline, and that you're syncing up your timeline with the schedule for a public review and adoption process. And this process is to make sure that the codes and standards have been thoroughly reviewed before starting the adoption process. And that's really, really important to make sure that those codes and standards have been thoroughly reviewed before starting the adoption process, because an adoption process won't happen if there are folks that haven't been brought along in the process. And so making sure that all the folks, and this goes back to Hilary's description of who you want at the table when you assemble your project team, making sure that those internal and external entities have been involved in the process and that there are no surprises along the way, so to help ensure a successful adoption process. So here, as I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, so once the project team has developed new codes or modified existing codes and standards to fill the gaps in addressing LID, the next step is to really review and adopt the new codes and standards. And as I mentioned, each jurisdiction has their own process for reviewing and adopting codes, so we're only giving you the basic steps here. So first, understanding the amendment process and schedule, and then next, really beginning the amendment process early to allow for rounds of both internal as well as external review. And so in your master timeline, when you're getting started on this project, making sure that you leave time for those internal rounds of review as well as external rounds of review. So what does an internal review process look like? Making sure that department managers review the proposed changes to the standards, and also that planning commissioners are briefed at various key junctures along the way, so that they are also aware of the proposed changes to the standards as well. And in terms of the external review process, in terms of stakeholder input, so providing an informal review opportunity and making changes to those amendments, and then having the formal public review process. And that will really help to ensure a smoother adoption process if you are bringing along both your internal and external stakeholders throughout the process of this project. So those are a couple of things that we've identified for step 5. And now moving into step which is ensuring successful implementation. And obviously this is ongoing. And after the new regulations have been completed, after you've completed the public review and adoption process and the standards have been administratively updated, this next step is to implement the new regulations and standards successfully. So ensuring successful implementation is step 6. So here we've identified a couple of things, and this is really kind of those steps from moving to the updates to actual implementation and what does it look like. So we've identified a few things here. One is identifying and prioritizing a list of implementation needs. And some of those needs can look like, at a lot of our in-person trainings, a lot of people have talked about the need for training, so training internal staff. So there are changes to the code language, and folks need to know about it. And so some of the people that are part of your staff at your jurisdiction will have been part of this code update and integration process. Some of them won't. And so everybody that's part of your jurisdiction that's going to be interacting with these codes really need to know what the language has changed to and what it's going to look like on the ground in terms of implementation. As well as internal and external outreach. Again, that's kind of a training component, but making sure that folks are aware of these changes. Any application materials that your jurisdiction might have, whether it's at the permit counter or on various websites. So making sure that the language is consistent across all documents that it might touch. So that can be a big undertaking, but really strategically thinking, all right, we're changing the code language here. Where else does this language show up in various documents along the way, and making sure that that language is consistent throughout. Other things to think about, here we've got creating a timeline to ensure that staff have adequate time to address the LID project review, implementation, and ongoing maintenance, and that's also something that's really important. And during the Q&A with our panelists, Pam is going to share a timeline that was created by the City of Seattle that she'll explain in just a minute. So something else that I think is really important to mention to ensure successful implementation is again, just this reviewing and revising application materials, whether they're, permit review bulletins, and process flow charts, any permitting information that's available to the public. And that's, again, I can't reiterate it enough, that changing language, making sure that the language is changed consistently across documents, across websites, anywhere that it might show up is a really important thing to do, and also to make sure that you provide time to be able to do that. So now I'm going to turn it over to those. We've gone through step 4, which was amending existing codes and developing new codes. We've talked about step 5, which is the public review and adoption process. And then we just talked about step 6, which is ensuring successful implementation. And so now I'm going to ask our panelists to talk to each of these steps 4 through 6. And I'm going to start out with step 4, which is amending existing codes and developing new codes. And the question that we are posing to the panelists, to both Luanne and Pam, is what process did you use to fill the gaps? And I'll start with Luanne at King County.
Well, we found, I would say, 3 areas of gaps. So one of them was not necessarily a gap. Our comprehensive plan, while it covers a lot of the topics, does so in language that's kind of archaic. So we're using our 2016 major comprehensive plan update process to bring our language into the current LID world and stormwater management world. We found a few little gaps in our landscaping code. We were weak on the use of native plants, and we wanted to be able to use landscaping for bioretention. So I just wrote little tweaks to the code, and they're being implemented through a routine update of the zoning code that happens a couple times a year. And then the really perhaps the most crucial thing are the need in our road standards for standard details for and specs for permeable paving and fire retention in the right of way, that sort of thing. And to fill those gaps, as far as I know, this is not within the scope of my work, but I've heard that we're looking for regional or national work that's been done, and we're going to crib that for for changes in road standards. And then our road standards are adopted through public rules, so it's not a legislative process.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Luanne. And,
yes. You know, one other thing, like the 1,000-pound gorilla that's sort of in the corner of the room, the design manual. A huge amount of LID stuff is design manual related. I mean, most of our LID is through the design manual, through requirements that it's implemented through new development and redevelopment. And so we are, of course, in the equivalency process with ecology, and we'll soon have a nice, shiny new design manual that will be adopted also by public rule and be available for other people to crib.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Luanne. Now turn it over to Pam at City of Seattle.
Sure, and I'll just take it up one level and just talk more about how we approach the process, and I'll use land use code as kind of an example. So for starters, the NPDES coordinator in each department, so in this for land use code in our planning and development department, identified an actual subject matter expert, so a land use code expert that could do the initial screen against the review document for where there might be opportunities to change the code. So initially a code expert identified potential opportunities. Then again, in the case of land use code, of course, that one person doesn't have necessarily decision-making power about A, whether a change gets made, and B, what the precise change can and should be. So there were sort of SWAT teams developed around different documents. So within the planning department, once that initial screen was completed, there was more of a working team that reviewed the opportunities that had been identified and made sort of qualitative decisions about moving forward with a change, a proposed change needing management or executive level input or a policy decision, or not recommending that a change be made and sort of stating why it wasn't needed. And this was all kind of tracked in an Excel spreadsheet. And then once there was clarity in terms of which code changes were going forward, the same code expert or colleagues were brought in to actually write the code changes or additions. And then we've already talked about sort of depending on the code, some changes need to be adopted via legislation, via ordinance. So we need to do outreach to city council, and depending on the code itself, that the department itself may have sole power to just update the code, and it is effective when the code is updated. One other thing I'll mention is that a number of our codes are shared between different departments, and so our stormwater code, for example, is jointly implemented by the drainage utility and the planning and development department. So changes to stormwater code and also changes to land use code, those two codes also point to each other, reference each other. And so in some cases, with those two codes in particular, we also needed to have sort of interdepartmental discussions about, where's the best place to address the SCAP that we're really trying to get at. Is the best place in land use code, or is the best place in stormwater code? Come to an agreement as a city, and then once we were all on the same page, it sort of fell back to the department and the leads that were identified within that individual department. So hopefully making sense, but there were a couple places where we also had to do quite a bit of kind of interdepartmental coordination for some of the changes that we wanted to make.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pam. So I heard a couple of things. I heard that you know, in terms of that there are a couple, even within one process, there are several different processes that are happening simultaneously. And from the City of Seattle's perspective, you know, identifying subject matter experts and having them look at the specific codes that they have an expertise in, suggesting potential language that then goes to, updates to language that then goes to a working group, and then it gets circled back to that particular subject matter expert if those opportunities for language updates are accepted and the city wants to move forward. And then I also heard from Pam that a lot of opportunity for cross-collaboration across departments because various codes land across departments. So making sure that those folks are all on board from the start and that everybody's around the table and that there's a clear process in terms of how the codes are going to be updated, if the codes are going to be updated, and then how they're going to be updated and who's doing it. So it sounds like you had had done your due diligence in terms of roles and responsibilities of folks and then a really clearly identified process moving forward. And then I heard from Luanne that there's an existing planning effort that's happening with the comprehensive planning, and so utilizing that opportunity as an opportunity to update codes as well. So what other code update processes are happening at the same time, or planning processes are happening at the same time to piggyback on. So thank you both, Luanne and Pam. And now moving into questions for Step 5. And Step 5 is the public review and adoption process. And we've identified a couple of questions here. The first question is we're asking Pam to speak to, which is, do you have any lessons learned that you'd like to share regarding the review and adoption process? For example, yeah.
Yeah, sure. A few things. One recommendation is to decouple major codes in terms of how you go through the public outreach and legislative adoption process if you have codes that have to be adopted by your city council, for example. So rather than try to bring all your codes to city council and do your outreach all at once on all your codes, my recommendation is to decouple them because they may go to different committees. There may be different issues brought up, and so rather than having, say, your entire package hung up because there's a question or a revision needed in one place on one code, making sure that everything else can move through smoothly, and whichever code may have an issue, we can go back and address that individually. So that's a recommendation. A second recommendation, it's been mentioned by several of my colleagues that many of our codes and standards already have regularly planned review and revision cycles, and just a heads up to the Phase 2 cities that those revision cycles may or may not align with the timeline that we have under the NPDES permit requirement, and so to be aware of that from the beginning and consider that you may actually need to be planning for a special amendment process to get your LID-related changes done before your deadline if the regularly planned revision cycle for that code doesn't coincide with ecology's timeline. And then the last thing I'll mention is that the permit language is clear that the changes are to be made effective, not just adopted. And just a heads up about that, that there may be in your local codes, there may be in your local laws, there may be a required kind of waiting period between when legislation is adopted and when it is effective. And just to be clear that you need to be planning your critical path to be effective by the deadline, not simply adopted by the deadline. In Seattle, for some of our codes, for example, there's a month lag. That's legislated. It's sort of a waiting period. So those were the three pieces of advice I have.
Excellent, Pam. And we pulled up your timeline. Would you like to take a couple of minutes to reference the timeline that you sent over to us?
Sure. And the actual dates are probably less instructive than the amount of time. So these are the actual dates that we were working under before our deadline was extended to the end of this year. I guess the few things I'll underscore that have been mentioned several times already. You'll see early council outreach. We were recommending to our departments that they brief their committees at the point of not having decided yet on final code changes, but actually brief the relevant council committee or council committee chair on the initial summary of potential opportunities for changes, so that the council and the committee chair had time to consider those and then come back and brief again before sending over the legislative package. So sort of that early and often outreach idea. And then we also recommended a similar approach with external stakeholder outreach. So you'll see, really early outreach, and then again another round closer to adoption. This is for the major codes, so stormwater code, land use code, maybe fire code, codes that require legislative adoption.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pam. I really appreciate that. And I think it's great to see, and really helpful to kind of see it on this time scale and all the various moving pieces and how they coincide on a timeline. So thank you very much, Pam.
Yeah, sorry, Gretchen, one more thing. So just to underscore that distinction between adoption and made effective, you'll see that we had a recommendation for making sure that any legislation was signed by the mayor by the 1st of April. Again, this is before we had the 6-month extension, and allowing close to 2 months for that lag between adoption and made effective by our original deadline, which was June 30th.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pam. And now the next question, that's part of step 5 and we're asking Merita, Pam, and Dawn to speak to this. Do you have any lessons learned that you'd like to share regarding the review and adoption process? And I'm asking Merita to start.
Great. Yeah, I'm just going to maybe reinforce a little bit some of what Pam had to say first, and that is one thing that I learned. I'm a stormwater person, and I think a lot of this process will be driven by stormwater people for many jurisdictions. And I wasn't aware when I got into this that certain codes have different kinds of adoption processes and have to go to different committees. And so that's really something you need to identify right away. And what I've done is for those codes that have kind of a special adoption process, I've partnered with somebody who's familiar with that process. So they're kind of helping lead me through that process as we're making the changes we need to for LID. And so when you talk about the public, I think the most important thing is to start early. We went ahead about a year ago, we went ahead and jumped into a presentation that we were having on our draft Stormwater Management Manual update. And we took about a half an hour at the end and said, hey, it's also a requirement of our permit to do all these LID code changes. We knew very little at that time of specific changes that we were going to make, but we just, we said, hey, it's coming, and this is a great opportunity right now for you to tell us if you have ideas about what you would like to see or what would help you implement LID or where you think things are lacking right now in the city of Tacoma. So start talking right away, even if you don't have specifics. Communicate to people in many ways. In Tacoma, we have an email list that people can go online and sign up, and it's for stormwater changes. And we have about 360 people right now on that email list, which we push communications about this project and other changes out through based upon that list, and also sending other emails, being on our city Facebook page, paper flyers, online notifications. We got about 20 members of the public out to our last public meeting on this project, which if you do a lot of public meetings for stormwater, that's pretty darn good. And then we got, several, like about 10 internal folks from just other departments in the city. So it was pretty well attended. We were very happy about that. But, think about that, 350 emails equated to about 25 people showing up. So you got to communicate however you can. If you've got a Twitter feed, if you've got a Facebook, all those things. And then make sure you go to important groups, like make a date, be on the agenda of Master Builders Association, any other groups that you have that are going to be affected by these changes. Go to them. Don't just expect them to come to you. Even if you call them and personally invite them, go to them as well. And just start early, you know, really get your message out that we are making changes, we want your input. We had a survey at our last public meeting, and it actually generated good comments that we are going to be using in our updates. So we're really happy about that. So surveys can be good. You know, you're kind of putting people on the spot when they come to a public meeting and you hand them a survey and you ask them to fill it in, but you can always also put it online and tell them that they could email it to you in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Merita. Lots of good tips. And now Pam from City Staff.
You know, I don't have anything further to add than what I answered to the previous question.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Pam. And Don.
Okay, and I'm with Merita and Pam. Start early, because it takes a lot longer than you think, and getting everyone engaged in the process. We haven't done a lot with the public, but we've done a lot with external stakeholders as part of our stormwater management manual revisions. We've had them involved, which does include some public and Master Builders Association and builders and private engineers, so on and so forth, environmental groups, Puyallup, River Council groups. So we're trying to get a widespread of individuals, and we've had a lot of good conversations and some very good input, and hopefully, you know, everything will just work out and we'll get everything taken care of and done on time. Sorry about that. The other thing is to be engaged on the outside too. I'm part of the permeable pavement group, and it's been a lot of hard work. It has been herding cats. But in the long run, if we have some regional tools and some regional specs, it makes it easier for everyone. Then they don't have to go from one jurisdiction to another, and everything's different. So that's very important. So look around and see what's out there, details, specifications, so on and so forth.
Excellent. Thank you, Merita, Pam, and Don. So we heard lots of really good things there in terms of lessons learned from, you know, engaging the council early and often in the process. And just to reference our toolkit again, at the end of the toolkit, and we'll send out another link to exactly where the toolkit is on the Washington Stormwater Center after this webinar for those folks that haven't had a chance to see the toolkit and dive in yet. But there is a document at the end that the Association of Washington Cities, as well as, you know, obviously Department of Ecology and our consultant team, work together to create a document that talks about communicating with elected officials, planning commissioners, and public works directors, and it goes step by step. So it follows the 6 steps that we've followed today during this webinar, and talks about identifies what we think they need to know in that step, and then actions that we are recommending that you ask that they take during that step. So that could be a good reference for engaging that audience early and often in your code update process. We also heard from Merita that there are certain codes that have different adoption processes, and really needing to be aware of those timelines and when those various code updates timelines are, and working with the key people that can help coordinate those updates as part of your process. And then Don reiterated that starting early, casting a wide net for those who you really need to involve early, and then seeing what's already been done and what's already out there in terms of tools and resources. There's a lot of great work that's already happened, both regionally and across the state, and so no need to recreate the wheel. So thank you, Merita, Pam, and Don. And now our final question for the panelists references step 6, which is ensuring a successful implementation process. And so the question that we're posing is, although you may have not made it to this step yet, what are some implementation tools that you are planning on using or would recommend to others for this step? And I'm going to ask Dawn to speak to that first.
Okay, first off, what I've been doing right off is encouraging everyone in my office and the industry and all of the county to go to these trainings, because that's where it starts. And then they're not just hearing it from me. This is really important, because I have to admit I'm passionate about this. So it's nice to get the message out there from numerous people, so you can take on the part you like, don't like, whatever. And the other thing, like with our storm manual, we will have trainings on our storm manual, so that'll be helpful, even though that's a huge document. The other thing we plan on doing is creating similar to what Seattle does with a tips page to help just general public to know what's going on. And then hopefully this will work out. We're planning on doing some checklists that I'll have our outreach people help, so it reaches the correct group on for every BMP to have a checklist for design, construction, review, so it helps the reviewers, and inspection and maintenance. So we're planning on doing that also, just to try to, so we're reducing the barriers on promoting LID to try to make it easier, and once again follow other areas that have the same standards, so that we are regionally a little more consistent than maybe we have been in the past.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dawn. And turning it over to Luanne from King County.
Training. We'll have a new stormwater manual. Lots of jurisdictions adopt our manual, so we will be having, and LID, like the new approaches to LID that are in the manual will be of interest to everyone. And we'll have trainings for jurisdictions. We'll have trainings for private sector engineers who will be designing using the design manual, and we'll be having trainings for internal folks who will be doing project review, that sort of thing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I think we heard training a couple of times from both Dawn and Luanne, that trainings, raising awareness among staff and other folks that are going to be working on these codes, the implementation of these codes. And we also heard that from Pierce County that they are doing what Merita actually mentioned, which is communicating with people in many ways, which I think is a really critical piece, getting this information out there in many different mediums, whether it's via the website, tips on the website, or it's checklists for each of the BMPs, trainings, spreading the word about updated manuals and language in updated manuals, and really helping to share information and knowledge across jurisdictions. I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that, a lot of great resources out there to help folks that haven't yet started, and to connect to the various jurisdictions to help get to help utilize resources that have already been developed or in process of being developed. So I want to thank all of our panelists for all of your notes from the field and your lessons learned and best practices. And I think it's always really helpful to hear from actual people that are in the trenches, that are working on these code update processes, and that are at various stages of their code update process, because each of the panelists and the jurisdiction that you represent is at a different stage in this process. And so I think it was really helpful. So I just want to thank all of you for all of your words of wisdom and just lessons learned and best practices. So thank you very much for taking the time to share them. And now we are going to move into the final section of our agenda, which is just the wrap up and evaluation portion of this webinar. And just a note that the reminder email that you all received had a link to the Washington Stormwater Center website as well. We'll be sending out this in an email to all the participants of the webinar again, so you'll see this email, but all of the resources that we referenced in the webinar today are all on the Washington Stormwater Center website. in addition, as part of this project, we have a hotline, and this is the number for the hotline. If you have any questions between now and June 30th, which is when the project concludes, about anything that you heard on the webinar today, if you have any specific questions for any of the panelists, if you have specific questions for any of the instructors today, just general questions about any of the 6 steps or any of the other content that you heard, please don't hesitate to contact us either via the training hotline or via the training email address that you see on the screen right now as well. We made a lot of references to the training toolkit, which was developed as part of this project, and that toolkit and all of the resources that are part of it, the review form, the subtopic focus sheets, those are all in, as well as the talking points and ways to engage your elected officials in this process, all in that toolkit. So we encourage folks to access it and utilize it as makes sense to your particular jurisdiction. It goes into a lot of detail about each of the 6 steps. There is another training initiative that's happening simultaneously as this training, and that is the statewide low-impact development training program. Many of you have likely already participated in some of the trainings. They are on a similar project timeline to the Code Update and Integration project timeline, which is training started in September of 2014, and they go through June 30th of 2015. So a couple more months of free training. So we would encourage you to access the course catalog. The course catalog has the universe of trainings that are being offered. If you were not able to catch one of the trainings because it already happened, all of the PowerPoints for each of those trainings are on the Washington Stormwater Center website as well. Here is a list of the trainings that have been offered or still being offered. They're introductory trainings, the intermediate trainings, as well as advanced trainings that have been offered on multiple topics related to low-impact development. So I encourage you to check out the course catalog, catch the few remaining trainings that there are happening between now and June 30th, and access the Stormwater website for those trainings that you weren't able to attend. And hopefully more trainings will be offered in the future, but for now, it's through June 30th.
And most of the trainings that are left are the advanced level trainings, and a few of those intermediate trainings will be available online. We're working on videos that went along with those trainings, so those will be available as a resource in the future.
Excellent. Thanks, Rebecca. Great. And as I mentioned, the online resources, all the materials that we reference in today's training, as well as the course catalog that is part of the statewide training program, is all being housed on the Washington Stormwater Center website. This project and these initiatives also have a Facebook page, so you can like us on your Facebook page and get updates via these initiatives that way, and also a Twitter account as well. Before we finally conclude, within the next few days, you'll be receiving an online evaluation, a link to an online evaluation, and it's a short evaluation survey, and we'd really encourage you all to take the time, just about 5 minutes, to let us know the things that you thought were really fantastic about this webinar, things that you wish that we had covered that we didn't get to. It will really help us to inform future training opportunities, so please look for that in your inbox within the next couple of days. And I just want to thank again our fantastic, amazing, wonderful panelists, many of which traveled from their various jurisdictions to be in the room with us today. And just want to thank Pam from the City of Seattle, Seattle Public Utilities, for her fantastic contributions, Merita from the City of Tacoma, Luanne from King County, and Dawn from Pierce County. Thank you very much for sharing both your best practices, lessons learned, some of your battle wounds and how you dealt with them, and it was just provided really great insights to what this looks like on the ground. So thank you all very much. And that concludes the webinar for the Low Impact Development Code Update and Integration webinar for Stormwater Practitioners. We want to thank each and every one of you for participating today in the webinar. And as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, if you do have any questions related to any of the content covered during the webinar, or have specific questions for any of our panelists or our instructors, both Rebecca and Hilary, please email or call, and we will get your questions answered. So thanks again, everybody, for your participation, and have a great day.